Hopefully this is on.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much. Save it for the stars of our forum today. I'm Patty Bellinger, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Public Leadership, and I teach here as an adjunct lecturer. It gives me enormous pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful event. Thank you to the forum for partnering with the center. Special shout out and welcome to our CPL alums and fellows, current fellows. We have, woohoo! This is the 10th anniversary of the Center for Public Leadership Fellowships, and we have 108 fellows who've come back for 36 hours of events, this forum, things that'll happen later tonight that will not be named, and a whole series of breakouts, and Madeleine Albright will be speaking tomorrow night with the fellows. So we've got a great program that the team has put together, and just want to say how deeply we respect and admire the work of the fellows and our alums. It's just impressive, incredible work, public service of all varieties that you all are doing out in the world, and we're thrilled to call you our own. And with that, I would just like to acknowledge the generosity of our donors and their vision. Without that, we would not be able to provide the financial aid and support to so many students that we are able to provide. When I joined literally about a year and a half ago, we had 4 fellowships and 51 fellows. And not due to me, we now have 9 fellowships, and we'll have 100 fellows in the fall.
Great.
So it's really grown. And with that, I would like to welcome my friend Maggie Williams. Thank you again. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. I'm Maggie Williams. I'm the director of the Institute of Politics here at Harvard, and we are so pleased to co-sponsor this forum today with the Center for Public Leadership. Thank you, Patty, for all your help. Before we begin our forum, I would like to acknowledge a much-loved and respected member of the IOP family, Senator Jeanne Shaheen, who is one of our distinguished panelists today. Senator, the IOP thanks you for your support and your unbridled passion for public service. Thank you so much for your leadership when you were here. Today, Jay will lead a discussion that tracks closely with a book she is writing, which explores the sociological theory of critical mass, the minimum number of people necessary to start a sustained change. Her book and this panel consider the impact of having 20 to 30% of women in any working environment. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about J. NewtonSmall, who is currently a fellow here at the Institute of Politics. She is the Washington correspondent for TIME. She joined TIME in 2007 to cover the Democratic side of the 2008 presidential campaign, traveling with Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. We remember her. She has also covered the White House, Congress, the 2012 Republican presidential campaign. She has been on assignment for TIME in Iran, Iraq, Jordan, the UAE, Ethiopia, Haiti, Indonesia, Australia, Canada, and Europe. So Jay, welcome, and this is a wonderful panel. We can't wait.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for having me here, and thank you so much to the panelists for agreeing to do this with me. I've interviewed all 3 of you in different times, and you all have such great stories, and I can't wait for the audience and everyone here to hear them. So I'm just going to introduce the 3 of you. This is Senator Shaheen. As Maggie said, she's senator from New Hampshire. She's been a senator since 2009. She just won bruising re-election. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
Glad
it's over.
Thank you. You're with the distinction of being, I think Scott Brown has now made history as the only man to have been beaten by 2 women for the Senate.
Absolutely. In 2 different states.
In 2 different states. And she also is a former governor of New Hampshire, the first woman to be both a governor and a senator, which is awesome. Yes. And this is Justice Nan Duffy. She's the Massachusetts Supreme Court Justice. She went to University of Connecticut in 1973, and then here at Harvard Law School in 1978. She served first in the probate and family courts, which she told me is actually kind of an unusual path for someone to rise up to the Supreme Court here in Massachusetts. She was also on the appellate court before being appointed by Patrick Duvall in 2011 to the Massachusetts Supreme Court. And then we also finally have Amy Schulman, who is teaching here at the business school. It was started as general counsel at Pfizer, and then rose to lead their $4 billion consumer and healthcare business before she left and came here, and has now actually got some really interesting biotech startup going on, as well as teaching. So I'm excited for her corporate perspective today. So originally, I got interested in this subject matter because I was writing a story, as Senator Shaheen knows, about the women of the Senate. In the last session, the 113th session, it was the first time ever that they had 20 women, and that women made up 20% of the Senate. And it really was a sort of moment of critical mass, not just in the sense of sheer numbers, but the women also sat on top of 10 out of the 20 committees in the Senate. So they produced more than half the legislation in the 113th Congress. It was not a very productive Congress, but what little got done, it was done by women. And so after I wrote, during the government shutdown, I wrote a story for the magazine about the women coming together at a time when things were so incredibly acrimonious, and they were really the ones who sort of came across the breach, used their personal friendships to form these sort of compromise and negotiated an end to the shutdown. And I had a lot of interest in writing a book out of that article. I'd had a bunch of offers, but I didn't want to write a book about just the Senate women, since half of them are already writing the books themselves, as Senator Shaheen knows. But I like the idea of critical mass, and so somewhere between 20 and 30% in any body, whether it's a legislative body or an appellate court or a corporate board, women really begin to have an impact. And less than that, either men don't listen or women don't speak up. They don't really have that much of an impact. But once you reach that tipping point, they really do begin to change things, and you see hugely differing outcomes. And so we're here today to talk about the successes of when you've reached critical mass, as all three women have experienced, and also some of the challenges that they still face. Now, for students here at Harvard, you might not realize that at least half the students here are female. Most universities graduate more women than men. Most grad schools actually graduate 60% more women than men. It doesn't feel like there's still a disparity. And in fact, 47% of the U.S. workforce is female. But out of that, two-thirds of the minimum wage earners are actually women. And not a lot of women have actually breached the upper echelons of executive boards, executive positions, directorial positions. And so this has become a challenge to really get that diversity in there, because once you hit that mark, then you really do begin to see better management, because women bring very differing management styles than men, and you begin to see better outcomes. And so I actually wanted to start to ask us Jeanne Shaheen. In my story, I wrote about how the night before the women kind of made this move, they all gathered in her offices in the Senate for a pizza dinner. And can you just tell us the story about how you all came to form this sort of group to talk about the shutdown?
Well, I have to give Susan Collins from Maine credit for going to the floor and putting forth a proposal that she thought was a compromise that people could buy into. And that was, I think, on a Thursday afternoon, and as Kelly Ayotte, who is my Republican colleague from New Hampshire, and I would point out that in the 2012 election, New Hampshire became the first state in the country to send an all-female delegation to Washington. Sadly, we lost one of those women, but there are still 3 out of 4 of us who are women. And so she and I were getting on the plane, and I said, we need to do something about this, and she agreed. And I said, well, how about if you and I host a pizza dinner at my office on Monday? When we get back, we'll invite all the women and see if we can come up with something. And so we did that, and that was really the genesis of a bipartisan group that had about 14 people, Republicans and Democrats, and independents. Angus King was part of that. That was really led by Susan Collins. 6 of us were women, which is a bigger than usual percentage of women to be part of that. And we didn't actually come up with the solution to get the government up and running again. But I think it was our efforts that really pressured the leadership on both sides of the aisle to come to some agreement. We had decided we were going to give them until a certain time on a certain date, and if they hadn't come up with their solution, we were all going to hold a press conference and offer our solution. And sure enough, I think Our deadline was 3 o'clock. At 1 o'clock, they held a press conference to announce that they'd reached agreement and the government was going to reopen. So it was, I think, that relationship that the women in the Senate had, that we trusted each other, we knew each other. We were able to say, we can find a way out of this because we can find a compromise.
And actually, can you just talk a little bit about, you have monthly dinners, right? I mean, and how does that bring you together, and how do you get, I mean, you know each other pretty well, right?
We do. They're really about every other month, and they started back when Kay Bailey Hutchinson and Barbara Mikulski actually started them. They were the senior ranking members on their sides of the aisle, and they decided that they really needed to get together and share their experiences, because at that time, I think when they started, there certainly weren't 20 women in the Senate. There were fewer than 9, I believe. And they said, we need to get together and share our experiences, our frustrations, just to have an opportunity to talk about how we're feeling about things. And so they didn't start out as an effort to address business in the Senate. They really started out as a way to form relationships, and that's what they've continued. And we go by Mikulski's rules that whatever is said at the dinner stays at the dinner. So none of our male colleagues ever hear what we have to say about them, which is a good thing. But what they've really allowed is for us to have a relationship where we can trust each other. And as we all know, we don't have to agree on everything to be able to get things done, but you do have to trust each other. And that's an element that is too often missing in Congress and in the Senate.
I mean, especially now when most people don't really know each other anymore, right? Everyone sort of runs home as soon as the legislative week is done. They don't live there anymore.
That's
you don't
right.
meet each other anymore. So it's really only the women that kind of know each other very well, right?
Well, I think we're the only sort of informal, formalized effort to meet on a regular basis across party lines.
Ever have any men try to join the club?
No, I'm not sure they would want to be there.
So Justice Duffy, when we spoke, you talked about the importance of diversity in courts. Justice Duffy is a former head of the National Women's Judges Association. I'd love to just get your sense of, in your own experiences, how having women on courts has changed perhaps the way the court functions or the way the court comes to decisions, and any kind of cases that might illustrate that.
Yeah, I had difficulty answering it the first time you asked me that question, and I still do. So maybe I'll start with the idea that for me, and I think for other women who I've talked to in the National Association of Women Judges, we just had a sense that it was important for society to see a diverse court. That we were concerned that maybe people weren't viewing the judiciary with the same kind of respect that perhaps they should have, because they didn't recognize themselves. Minorities and women didn't see themselves. And so it really started more from that sense. It came from that deep sense that maybe democracy was at stake here, and so we needed to have more women and more minorities. So that was the genesis of my involvement in the National Association of Women Judges, to really get that critical mass up. So that was one, how we look to the world. And of course, with that, this strong sense that, women and minorities on judicial collegial decision-making bodies, appellate courts, really might make a difference in the laws. And if you look at the laws historically, when there were only white males, you see that people would write about women in kind of derogatory terms and I think they thought they were applying sort of a general law and not really being personally biased or even speaking from their own experiences about that. And so I think you could safely say, although there's thin proof for it, but I have some, that by changing the makeup of our courts, you might also change how laws come out. And there are 2 studies. I haven't done extensive research on this, but there are 2 that support this. And they're only about federal courts, and they're only about the appellate courts, because that's what we call the collegial court. And those studies suggest, they were really from about a decade ago, that it doesn't matter so much the number of women, but if there are women and minorities of a critical mass at a particular appellate court, there are statistical outcomes that favor either sex discrimination suits in favor of plaintiffs or affirmative action suits. So it doesn't have to be that the woman or a member of a minority is writing the decision. The idea was that if you're on that court, you are making a difference by your presence. And so that leads me to this. I think that just my presence on a court, on the Supreme Court, on the appeals court, and the presence now of 3 other female colleagues, as well as on the appeals court, and members, I'm still the only Asian on both courts, but African-American members, people who are gay or lesbian, that really has made all of us more, I think, conscious when we speak, as we do in our consultation room, about how a case should come out. We're not just thinking, oh, this is how I think it should come out, and sharing that point of view, but I think we are also thinking, what is Jay going to be thinking about this? You know, my thoughts, what is she hearing when I say this? Oh, am I really taking into account that she's an immigrant, or I'm an immigrant, which I am? You know, those kinds of thoughts, I think, are very important to all of us, and so I do think they affect decision making. And you had another question, but maybe that's enough for now.
No. Well, you did talk to me about one case in particular where I think it was on the appellate court where you said that you didn't feel that the men really understood that, you know, I think it was someone was bringing, it was a stalker or somebody who had a restraining order put against him, and he brought flowers to a woman. Oh, yes. Yeah, and that the men was like, oh, well, flowers, that's not much of a threat. And can you tell us about it a little bit?
And I I can't tell you it's because I'm a woman. I've never also been abused, so I couldn't, but I had an experience from much experience on the probate and family court at that point in time. So a lot of it is experience rather than gender or race or ethnicity. But that experience led me to realize that women who are approached by abusers, even with a seemingly friendly thing like a rose, it's frightening. So I did, and I don't know if that's a gendered perspective, but I had that perspective to bring. And there was one other, and I don't know, again, if I'm speaking from a gendered perspective or not, but our 25-member court, I'm trying to give you how many people there are so you don't figure out who I'm talking about here. But the issue had to do with what is aggravated rape, and whether beating someone in the context of rape couldn't be an aggravation of the rape if it happened afterwards, because, and this roughly fell into male-female, not entirely, of course, nothing really does, but it seemed to me and to us when we talked about it that there was a stronger sense from the male side that, well, no, rape's about sex, and so if it's about sex, this isn't an aggravation, whereas I and others saw it as not a sex act, but a violent act. So yes, it was. So I can talk about this because these are fully represented in published opinions, and the SJC, I wasn't sitting on it at the time, agreed. So, but that I thought was a representative of what you're really talking about.
And Amy, so you obviously have had experience in the corporate world, and you've been on corporate boards, although you say that most of the boards you're on, you're still the only woman. But as a woman who rose through the ranks in the corporate world, I mean, there hasn't been as much advancement in the private sector as there has been in the public sector. All 3 branches of the government are reaching critical mass about the same time around now. So you have about 30% in the administration, about 35% of federal courts are women, and 20% of Congress, whereas the corporate world is sort of stuck at 17% and has been for more than a decade.
Stuck at 17%.
Do you just want to talk a little bit about why you think it might be stuck?
So it's really interesting because as I was listening to both the Justice and the Senator, one of the things that really struck me is how profoundly differently those dynamics play out in the corporate world. Because in the corporate world, if you are seen as the emblem of a point of view, that's actually probably going to hinder your ultimate chances for advancement. And so as opposed to kind of, well, we have heightened sensitivity because Amy's speaking from the perspective of, a straight white woman who's also a mommy, or, so-and-so speaking from the perspective of an African American or a lesbian or an immigrant, that would actually not be positive. Right? So it may be what the prevailing kind of norms are thinking in the back of their mind. Oh, there goes Amy again, speaking from a women's perspective. And that isn't helpful. So that sensitivity, to the extent that it makes people kind of speak less freely or question their assumptions, makes them self-conscious, and that doesn't make them necessarily want you to be part of the conversation. So I think that dynamic of critical mass, to me, is what allows for authenticity, because then instead of being seen as kind of the epiphenomenon, you're actually free to express the range of points of views that you may have, and it's harder to marginalize you. And conversely, as I got more senior, I think the question for women is, at what point do you spend that political capital that you've amassed? So you clearly have it by virtue of being around the table. But there's this tremendous anxiety that if I spend it, then I'm going to be reduced to that. And I think when there are other women in the room, when there are other diverse perspectives, you realize that actually one of the great ironies of life is the more capital you have, the more capital you're spending, the more you have. And I think that, you know, there's a tendency sometimes to feel that we need to save things for when we really need them. I mean, I used to be like this about airplane miles, right? I mean, from all the flying that I did in my life, you know, at one point I had, you know, like 1 million miles, right? And I'm like carefully sitting there saving those miles. For what? I mean, the airlines never let you use them. When am I ever going to do it? But I'm like saving them for, quote, when I really need them. By the time I really need them, it's going to cost 1 million miles, you know, to fly from New York to Cleveland. And so at some point you realize the more that I am seen as a transacting player, the more I'm connecting people, the more I'm spending political capital advancing junior people, the more I'm able to do kind of whatever it is that people do when they're spending their political capital, actually the more power I have. But I don't think you instinctively realize that when you're new at the table. And so I think one of the great pleasures that happens when there's critical mass is that kind of reassurance and this idea that you're not sidelined every time you kind of say something or speak something because everybody's wondering, you know, where is that coming from?
Let's also talk a little bit about critical actors, because part of the power of, you know, critical mass isn't just the idea that you have the 20 or 30%, it's the seniority that some of these actors get. So in terms of the Senate, it was the fact that half the women were sitting on top of committees, and they were able to really make, you know, draft legislation, impact change, and they were very powerful. But sometimes in the corporate world, you're kind of the only critical actor, right? Like you're you're kind of lonely at the top thing. And what do you do in that case? And how do you sort of find friends?
Right. So I mean, one of the things that you know, one of the things about being in that position where you realize that actually at a certain point in your life, what you're doing is you have the tremendous both luxury and sorrow of being in the position of giving to others and opening the door, even as you may say, gee, there weren't people ahead of me. Given my age and my position, there just wasn't an entire generation of women who were there before. And so, you know, I think one of the privileges of being in a position like this is making sure that, you know, you're bringing along other people, and that is people and that, you know, the conditions for diversity is an abstract good in and of itself, but it only thrives when you're actually creating and insisting that the organizations to which you belong welcome the diversity, right? Because there's no point in having kind of a bunch of, you know, diverse voices around the table if there's one voice clamping down and speaking, because then all that happens is people get frustrated and demoralized and no change occurs. So I think the job of those of us who are here is to say, now that we're all around that table, make sure that the organizations actually are porous enough to hear what people are saying. And so I think in that sense, the role of a critical actor really can change organizations. And I think one of the great pleasures of my life is hearing from people now who are in their late 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, who call me up and say, you're not going to believe what I'm doing now, and I'm doing this because of this thing that you and I did 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And, you know, I like to say I have 3 biological sons, and I have an entire family of professional daughters who I hold, you know, nearly as dearly as I do my 3 biological sons. And it's a great pleasure of being at this stage in my life.
We're going to open it up to questions in a minute, so if people want to, just go to the microphones. I think there's 4 of them around if you have any questions. But I'm going to start with just a first question to Senator Shaheen. One of the great stories of the 113th Congress was the fact that you and 6 other women were on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and there was an amazing hearing where you guys, ladies or gals, sort of hauled the generals into the rooms, into a hearing room, and really lambasted them on sexual assault in the military and embarrassed them. And it was amazing. And you really got, forced change for the first time. It's been 30 years women have been trying to do this. Forced change for the first time in 30 years to get them to sort of be responsible and clean up their act on this stuff. Tell me a little bit about this and what it was like, and how did you guys decide, okay, we're going to bring them in and do this together?
Well, I think the importance of, at that time, there were 6 women on the Armed Services Committee. Now there are actually 7. Mm-hmm. So we're making a little more progress. But I think it was having women there who could stay focused on that issue. Because as you point out, most of us, well, some of you are too young, but many of us here remember the tailhook scandal in the early 90s. And things had not changed. So there was a commitment to change things. There was a zero tolerance policy on sexual assault in the military. But in reality, the same practices kept coming back. And so I think the women on the Armed Services Committee just decided that it was time, and that we were going to keep that as an issue that we're concerned about. It's bipartisan. Everybody agrees we should not have sexual assault in the military. And that we were going to use every opportunity to try and address that issue. So the hearing was interesting, and it's an interesting, there has been coverage of that issue that has focused on the differences between Claire McCaskill, senator from Missouri, who had one bill to deal with the issue, and Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, who had another bill to deal with the issue. And some of the reporting on the differences in those 2 bills had more to do with speculation about how it was the women who were supporting the legislation, and it was these differences among women, and
Catfight
yes,
was one of the headlines.
And that is a real disservice both to the issue and to those 2 women. I happen to be a co-sponsor of Senator Gillibrand's bill. But the reality is everybody was committed to addressing the issue. And if there had been 2 men with 2 different versions of how to address the issue, we would not have seen a headline that said catfight. So it comes back to your assumption that we have critical mass in Congress and in the Senate. And I would argue that we may not be there yet. When I was here at the IOP in 2005 and 6, I did some research around women in political positions. And one of the things I remember is that if you compared the United States and the number of women in our Congress, our parliament, to the world, we were 64th in the world in terms of the percentage of women. Now we're 75th. So while we have made some gains, we do have 20 women in the Senate. We elected 2 more women in this last election, but we also defeated 2 women in the Senate. But we only have 19% of the women in Congress. More women than ever, but it's still only 19% of the Congress. So I think we're making progress, but it's too slow, and there's still too much to do.
Great. Why don't we start with some questions?
Hi, my name is Megan Walsick. I'm a senior at the college, and my question is for Senator Shaheen. I'm from Dover, New Hampshire.
All right.
Yeah. In 1998, you came and visited my kindergarten class at Garrison Elementary School.
Good.
And
I'm really not that old.
And it was a big deal because it was the first public kindergarten class in the city of Dover, as you probably remember. And my question for you is, now that President Obama is making these pushes to expand to public preschool, what steps do you think we need to take in the Senate, either from this critical mass of females or just in general, to really see this come to fruition?
Well, I have a great story about my visit to Garrison Elementary, which I think you all will appreciate. It was not too long after I got elected governor, and I had run on a platform that said we should provide public kindergarten for all young people in New Hampshire. It was one of the few states that still didn't have public kindergarten for everybody. And so this was one of my first public kindergarten visits, and I thought it went really well. You know, I had a great time with the students and got a chance to talk policy about why public kindergarten is so important, early childhood education, and so I thought it was great. And then my state trooper, a couple of days later, told me that he had talked to the parents of some of the kids, and they had said how disappointed they were when I visited their school, because they thought the first woman governor should come like the Queen, that I should have an entourage and I should have a ball gown and a magic wand, and that's what they were expecting. And it shows the challenges that nobody knew what a woman governor should be like when I first got elected in New Hampshire. But I think getting public preschool would be critical for this country. All the research, the data tells us that the earlier we can intervene in a child's life, the better in terms of their successes, their ability to learn to read at grade level, to graduate on time. The fewer kids get in trouble when they have that early education. The challenge, like so much of what we're dealing with in Congress, has to do with the resources. And there's a lot of agreement among women senators, but there's not agreement on every issue, and there's certainly not agreement on what we're willing to fund and what we're not willing to fund. And I think you will see that that's where issues often break down along party lines, whether it's women or whether it's men.
Well, I have the newspaper from that event with me, so maybe I can show you how.
Oh, good. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I forgot to say, as everyone who's been to a forum before, you know the rules. When you ask a question, just please give your name, where you're from, and the question should end with an actual question. So no sort of diatribes. Did you have a question?
Hi, my name is Untraditional. I'm actually a former, alumni of the Center for Public Leadership Fellowship programs. I was really struck by the difference you pointed out in the private sector and I guess the public sector. I work for the Department of Health and Human Services, and I've been in 3 different agencies, and there is absolutely, in each agency within the department that I was in, easily the staff were majority women. The top 3 leadership positions in the first agency were held by women, then the second agency, the acting director was a woman who was a graduate of Harvard Medical School, and my current job, my team lead, my division director, my group director are all women. And so I guess I would like to dig a little bit deeper on this thing of like, what is so different about the private sector versus, say, federal government or other sectors that obviously allows women to thrive quite a bit? You know, I mean, a large organization like the U.S. federal government, the largest employer in the world, but not so much in other sectors. What's the difference? Can you tell me more?
You know, I guess I would challenge the notion, though, that women are thriving. I mean, apropos this story, you know, in some ways that's just an incredibly poignant story. So here you are, a governor who's clearly championed public education, done the actual hard work, and that kind of crushing blow of expectations that, you know, rolling up your sleeves and getting it done, but yet you're supposed to come in like, you know, with glass slippers and a ball gown. It's a funny story, but to me it's a deeply poignant story. And so I think it's terrific. You have, you know, on this panel, you know, examples of, you know, clearly women who have broken through in success, but that we are ranked 74th, you said?
75th.
75th in terms of number of women, and that, you know, to me what that evokes is, why is it that women are not championed? Why haven't we embraced this cause freely, right? Why haven't women said, this is critical enough to us that we need to support women candidates? Why? I mean, there's still not that many women on the judiciary, although, you know, we're doing better. And so I think, you know, that question of thriving may be, you know.
But I'm specifically pointing out the federal sector, which,
Right.
again, The Department of Health and Human Services
If I
is
could
led
just,
by
if
Sylvia
I actually just
Burwell.
jump in here a little bit and say, in the research that I've found, and I have a chapter that actually looks at public versus private sector, is that there's a number of factors. First of all, women in the private sector, they have almost universally male white bosses, whereas women in the public sector, you have the power of female voters, which is incredibly powerful, and so you have presidents that are forced to appoint federal judges and secretaries of in the cabinet and all kinds of nominees who are women because women voters expect that of him. And you also have there's also sort of, and I love New Hampshire for this. It's a great story of like the barriers to entry, I think, for public service is a little bit less than the barriers for private service, in the sense that New Hampshire is one of the most representative democracies that we have in our state, since there's something like 600 members of the state legislature.
Now you exaggerate.
How many?
New Hampshire has 400 members of our House. We have the third largest legislature in the English-speaking world after the British Parliament and the American Congress.
Okay, so 400, there we go. So it's a very small leap to go from school board to, state representative, and it's a part-time thing. You can be a mom, you can have kids, you can sort of do that, and then you can get as involved as you'd like. You can, if your kids go off to school, you can start, becoming committee chairs, and then you can advance to be governor or senator, and that's why there's so many successful women in New Hampshire. It's a great state in terms for female representation.
And our voters are smart too.
They are actually a huge, as a journalist, I can say they're an enormous pleasure to talk to. When I do early primary states and presidential elections, Iowa and New Hampshire voters talk about policy, and then after that, everybody's like, well, I kind of like that guy. I don't really like the other guy. So they don't know anything about what's going on. But, and then the third thing is that you see a lot of women who, you almost wish it wasn't this way, but they sort of say, well, I'm missing my kid's game, but it's okay because, I'm voting on Iran sanctions, or I'm voting on something that's critically important to the future of our country, and so therefore it's okay if I'm, missing something of my child's life. Whereas you don't see a lot of women in the private sector saying, well, I'm missing my kid's game because I want to make $1 million deal, and I think that maybe there should be more women who want to do that, frankly.
There is that difference too in the legal profession. I mean, we're edging up. There are more and more women being appointed, and so the percentages are up, but they're as flat in the partnership level as they are in corporate America.
Yeah.
It's flat 14, 17, I think it is at this point.
Yes. Yeah.
Just and it's and we approach, I'm going to say we now, we in the legal profession, in the judiciary and in the law broadly, I mean, this is a big problem. It seems entrenched. I don't know yet the answer. It's certainly a problem, and maybe some of it is that. I mean,
but I don't think it's only the opt-out issue. I mean, one of the really interesting things when I was in private practice at a law firm, the absence of a negative message when you were coming up through the ranks for partnership was considered a positive message. So, and yet I think women and male mid-level associates heard the absence of a negative as a positive quite differently. So to be specific, you would go as this fifth level associate, which is when you're kind of anxious about making partner. It's often the years that you have tugs on you in other ways. If you have a spouse or a partner, that person is also starting to earn income, so you, in theory, have a little bit more latitude. And you would go in having just, really worked all these daunting hours, and, the partners who were reviewing you would say, everything's okay. Now, I can guarantee you that everything's okay is heard quite differently by most women than it is by most men. So most women are like, okay, just okay? Are you kidding me? I'm like killing myself here and it's just okay? And many guys, not all, will hear, everything's okay. I'm on top of the world. And, unwittingly, the exact same phrase. So then it compounds itself, because I walk out and you say to me nicely, how'd you do in your review? And I said, oh, I did okay. And you say to me, just okay? Mine was great. And now I'm thinking, wait a second. I thought we were kind of both doing the same. How come his is great and mine is just okay? And you start thinking, hers was just okay. Maybe I don't want to kind of keep on working with her, because if she's not on the partnership track, that's not going to help me so much. And so from this completely allegedly neutral message, things start spiraling quite differently. And I'll give you the one other thing that's lately been obsessing me is so-called neutral performance evaluations, right? So that there was a study done recently that showed that when women are given kind of these 360 evaluations, their performance is assessed on characterological flaws. So like, Amy needs to be less shy. That would probably not be a critique people would say about me, but in theory, Amy needs to be less shy. Whereas with a guy, they would say, Joe needs to speak more. So it's a behavior that he can fix. It's a character assessment on my part. That's why the story of the ball gown is so poignant to me. And so then that starts getting built in. And so for me, the questions of kind of the opt-out, I think there are plenty of good reasons to choose not to want to climb the corporate ladder. And there are plenty of people who, for lots of good reasons, don't find the pursuit of that meaningful. But I don't think it's as simple or to say that women choose not to do it disproportionately for those reasons, because I think there are many countervailing pressures in terms of how the supposedly neutral evaluation process gets played out, how neutral words get heard differently, and an entire set of things start spiraling. And this is what I mean about organizations needing to take responsibility for helping people to hear the messages in the way that we intend them. So I don't know if that...
There's a great book that details exactly what you're talking about by a woman named Anne Valian called Why So Slow? And it talks exactly about that, about how a woman and a man can start in a corporate environment at the same time with the same background, the same education, and what happens over their career as they try and move up, and that kind of difference in the way women are viewed.
Yes?
Nadia Farjoud. I graduated from the college in 2013, and I work at Political Parity, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization working to advance women in politics. And actually, our research director sent me here as the ambassador of her question. She wants to know...
Where is she?
Writing her dissertation.
Okay.
If you had to choose between having a critical mass of women in office or a key women or key sets of women in positions of power, so the head of a committee, which would you choose and why?
Interesting.
Well, I'm going to just totally disavow the question. I think it's the wrong question. We obviously need both. When I was governor, I got to appoint the first woman to our Supreme Court. That woman is now the chief judge of our Supreme Court. And there are other women on the Supreme Court as well. So it's not about whether women are going to be in critical positions. It's about how do we make sure women are in critical positions and that they can influence the environment so that other women can get there too.
Anything else from, okay. Yeah, up here.
Oh, okay, now it's working. Hi, I'm Sarah from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm a freshman at the college. And my question is that we've talked a lot, both in discourse and at this forum, about women at the top. And I want to know what ideas you have on what I've heard Senator Gillibrand refer to as sticky floors with women on the bottom, I guess you could say, facing pay inequality and things like racist sexism and working to take care of families and things like that. What can we do as people and as women to support the average woman?
Anyone want to take that?
Were you looking at me? Well, I think it's a hard question for a judge. Are you talking to me as a woman or are you talking to me as a judge? I mean, one of the wonderful things and why I'm so glad to be and have the job that I have or have had so long is that you can actually make a difference. You can, in your job too, you can make a difference in the way the one-on-one decisions that I made when I was on the trial court for 8 years. Every single person who comes into my court, I can make a difference in their lives. On the appellate court, and now, make big changes in how the laws are interpreted to benefit or not people who are affected in that way. So that way, but not everybody can be on the Supreme Court, right, or the appeals court, or even be a judge. I mean, it's hard. So so you vote. You vote. And that's why I think it's so important. In a bigger sense, I'll go back to this. We have a constitutional democracy, and I think it's at risk unless we have informed voters. So it's easy to say we vote, but you have to vote and you have to be allowed to vote, and you have to be an informed voter. So we need those things, and we can all work to make sure that happens, I think.
So I think it's great that the women here have broken the glass ceiling that so many women have. But until we're able to provide those opportunities for all women, we haven't succeeded. And right now, there are a lot of things that we need to address in the workplace, structurally, with the way we support women and families, that we have not addressed. So we need to raise the minimum wage. We need equal pay for equal work. We need to provide retirement benefits for all workers in some way so that everybody can opt in. You know, I think it's terrible that we do not provide maternity leave, paid maternity leave for federal employees. That's just not acceptable.
Up here?
Hi, my name is Carolina, and I am a sophomore at the college. And my question is for the senator, and it kind of ties back to the question that was asked just before. And it regards the issue of imposing legislation on gender equality in the workforce. So we've seen how countries in the recent events, like Germany, they passed legislation which imposes a quota on company boards for women. And I just wanted to ask what you see the future of the United States being regarding this issue of passing legislation and what the major challenges to it are.
We may want Amy to give us her insights on
Quotas.
I think it would be really hard to get that kind of legislation passed. You know, one of the reasons that we're falling farther behind in terms of number of women, if we look at the world, is because it's harder in our constitutional democracy to pass those kinds of quotas and be successful than it is in a parliamentary system where they can say, you know, your slate has to have 20 women on it, or 20% of your slate has to be women, or you're not going to get the funding to run for office. So I think we've got some barriers that make it more challenging to do those kinds of quotas here in the United States.
We want to talk about.
Yeah, and you know, it's an interesting body of research about whether those quotas will in fact change the behavior of those boards. So, I mean, it's an experiment I think that many of us are watching with great interest, because the academic research on quotas on European boards is at least mixed currently. I would probably say there hasn't been enough time yet to play out, but there's a large number of female academics who are staunchly feminist who say in Europe these quotas haven't changed the behavior because actually it keeps the women there in a box because they're there because there's a numeric quota. There are other people who say, okay, yes, but let it play out a bit because over time the mass will change. One of, I think, the great things actually about Pfizer's corporate board were there were 4 women on it. And I think that changed over the time that I was at Pfizer, and I was able to see it really actually change the dynamic and the tempo of the board. So I am a huge believer that corporate boards need to have you know, larger numbers of women. I don't know, given our history and our style of democracy, whether that would work, and I don't even know yet whether I would say it's working in the Scandinavian countries that, you know, first pioneered it.
Dara?
Hi, I'm Dara. I'm in junior college, and I'm from Dublin in Ireland. And I just spent I spent 6 months last year working for an organization that trains women election candidates. And one of the things that really struck me when I was doing that, I was the first man they ever hired, and I would go to a lot of meetings where I would be the only man in the room of like 40 women. And sometimes it kind of struck me that a lot of the work was preaching to the choir. And I'm wondering if any of you have ever tried to like get men on board with the issue of getting more women in decision-making roles.
Oh, yes. We thought of it, actually. It's critical that we have men who support us.
I have to say that one of the best things that I encountered in all the research that I've done is some of the most successful ones has been in Britain and Australia. They have these sort of public-private partnerships where they have a minister that also works with CEOs that recruits women and promotes women, and it has the worst name on the planet. It's actually called Male Captains for Change. And I kind of giggled when I first heard about this, but actually it's quite successful. And like they've actually done an amazing job of, you know, really bringing in a lot more women on boards and bringing women into the legislature. And I think it's a model that a lot of people say should be applied in the United States, that if we really wanted to advance more women in the executive offices or whether on the courts, that there should be this sort of initiative where men, who are CEOs, who are in positions of power are brought in and really sort of, have some transparency and held accountable and said, okay, let's do this, let's create goals and let's really and hire more women. So.
And I think it's one of the things that gives all of us hope is actually your generation and the number of men and women who are committed to this. I mean, in my class that I teach over at the business school, whenever there's an issue that comes up on kind of the proverbial balancing question or on any of these issues, it is often as many men who are committed to talking to me about it because they have partners or spouses or siblings, and they're deeply invested. So I'm not naive. I don't know that will hold as true when those men get into positions of power as it does now when they're climbing, or as they want to make sure their female professor, who's obviously deeply committed to it, knows that they're committed. But I also do believe that your generation lives this very differently in terms of what you've seen many of your parents and other people go through. So I'd like to believe that you all will make a difference in ways that we haven't yet been completely able to at our level.
I want to just share in that. I mean, I mentor a lot of, I don't have students, but I mentor my law clerks, and I make it a point to have, hi Ezra, to have men as well as women that I can mentor now, because they are going to be, maybe you don't realize that, you are the leaders and the ones who are going to make these choices. And I expect that you will be able to help make a difference. So thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, my name is Mary. I'm a doctoral student at the education school. I'm curious about your perspectives on the role or the voice or weight of women's voices in the public discourse based on the issues that they advocate. So specifically, I've been leading a career in public education, which is traditionally, as an issue, gendered female. And even Senator Shaheen, there's, I think, a great deal of folks who would say, it is, you're championing a women's issue by advocating for early education or fill in the blank. Is it your perspectives, and I ask this to all the panelists, that what, I guess, do we need to be doing as women in order to kind of either expand the responsibility for these traditionally gendered female issues to men as well, and or do women need to take on roles or advocate causes that are not traditionally female?
You're going to
Go
answer?
ahead.
I just had a thought. I had a discussion before I came here about if you look historically, some of the things that you now say are female didn't used to be. They used to be men who actually, there were male teachers more, there were male secretaries, and in European countries, predominantly women doctors. I mean, that may be an economic issue, who knows? So I don't know if that's the answer. Here's a personal anecdote. Nobody grows up to say they're going to be a divorce lawyer, right? And I was one, not because I grew up to think I was going to be, just because it became an opportunity in my law firm. I was a litigation partner and associate, and it was an opportunity, and I was initially hesitant because I thought, they're putting me there because they thought that was kind of a good role for me, woman. But I liked it. I was good at it, and here I am. So, I picked what I was good at. I didn't worry anymore what people thought about it. I said, gee, I like this. I like dealing one-on-one with clients rather than different other things that I might have done. And so I guess you pick what you're passionate about.
I do think, for the Senate and for Congress, Barbara Mikulski has a term called macaroni and cheese issues, that she sort of talks about how women,
the macro issues and the macaroni and cheese issues.
Yes, exactly. When she came into the Senate in 1987, for example, breast cancer research funding was $100,000 a year. She increased that by 1,000-fold. There was no scientific research that was done on women. All the scientific research that was funded by the U.S. government was done on men because that's what they legislated and that's what they mandated. And so there was a lot of low-hanging fruit, I think. Title IX, there's all these examples of, when women came into the legislature, when women started to impact how laws are passed, that they really made a difference. That sort of low-hanging fruit, I think, is almost all done or not done, but like now you see women, not totally done actually, come to think of it, there's still equal pay, there's still a lot to go, but you do see a lot more senators, a lot more members of Congress kind of branching out into areas where you just would never have thought of them 20 years ago. I mean, Dianne Feinstein, who's the chair of the Intelligence Committee, issuing reports on torture and taking on the White House on these issues. You see women, taking on issues of readiness in the military and all, joining police forces and firefighters and all kinds of things. And so that's, you do sort of are beginning to see women taking on quote unquote untraditional roles, which is a term I hate, but it is a slow process, and one that I think only really happens when you've reached sort of certain groundswells.
I think that's true. I think that things change when people are used to seeing women in certain positions. One of the challenges that you talk about in terms of identifying women with certain areas is that's the way voters view women candidates. And so voters historically have viewed women as being good on, what are considered the soft issues, education, social services, not so good on economics, on national security, and women are generally viewed as being more honest. So it can cut both ways in an election year where people are concerned about honesty. More women get elected. But it's a challenge that I think, as Jay says, only gets solved over the long term as more women get into positions, because, like men, women care about all kinds of things. We care about national security, we care about education, and so we shouldn't be buttonholed any more than men should be buttonholed.
Unfortunately, this will have to be our last question since we're out of time.
Hi, my name's Aisha. I'm a freshman at the college, and I have the honor of serving as one of Jay's liaisons this semester. My question is just for all of the panelists, and what your definition of parity is, because we talked a lot about critical mass, but is parity when we have women serving in these untraditional roles, or is it when a woman can actually stand on a stage and maybe cry and show more emotion, or is it when a woman assumes is as aggressive as a male, or demonstrates these kind of masculine qualities? What is parity?
It's when you can do all those things.
Yeah?
Yeah. I think parity is about making sure that women have the same opportunities as men. I have 3 daughters. One of my daughters is here this afternoon, and I want to make sure that she can do anything that any man can do. And if that's become president, then all right. If it's stay at home with her kids, that's fine too. If it's, go off and become an explorer, I don't care, whatever it is. Parity is making sure that women have the same opportunities as men, and that we don't have to have a forum when she's my age that says that's about women in power, because women have already achieved power.
I think that's a great place to leave it, and I think just a couple of final notes. One is that this is a lot of people will say, what's the importance of having critical mass with women, and there's a couple of points on that. One is that when you have a balance of women and men in a workforce, or at least you reach a critical mass of women, you are actually more productive. You do actually perform better, and this is something that Ernst & Young has studied. They organized their 88,000 accounting teams globally into, they sort of did this cruel social experiment without telling them, and organized them into sort of teams of women and men, and then mixtures of women and men, and they found that the best possible results, the best teams that performed the best, were ones that had at least 35% women on them. And so it is important to have this diversity of women and have enough women in the workforce in order to achieve that diversity. And it's also important because as the baby boomer generation retires, we're going to face an enormous shortfall of workers in the United States. About 40 million workers, I think, over the next 30 years. And the only way to really make up that shortfall, unless we miraculously decide our immigration policies or liberalize our immigration policies, is to bring women up to full employment in the United States. And that almost completely solves the shortfall in the workforce. And so it is something to think about in order moving forward, that economically speaking, it's actually sort of necessary in our to do this. And my last little sort of note is a pitch for my study group. Since if you're interested in the topic matter, every Thursday at 4 o'clock, I'm going to be looking at different chapters of my book and different sort of aspects that we've touched on here. And Nan Duffy is actually going to be one of my guests coming back, so we'll delve more deeply into the federal judiciary when she comes back. And state judiciary, excuse me, when she comes back. And I just also want to thank everybody for your perspectives here today. It was just awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very nice. Thanks so much.